The Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 10th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
At that time, the festival of Hanukkah took place in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." Jesus answered, "I have told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name testify to me. But you do not believe, because you do not belong to my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. What my Father has given me is greater than all else, and no one can snatch it out of the Father's hand. The Father and I are one." The Gospel of the Lord. So last week, I was reading something in the paper about healthcare reform. And like many people, every time I hear or see something about healthcare reform, my eyes glaze over. So I'm not exactly sure why I chose to read this article, but I remembered the article because it lifted up a statistic that I had never seen before. The author began by talking about how in most polls and most surveys, almost everybody in the United States thinks that the American healthcare system is basically a mess and needs to be changed. And he said, depending upon where you are in the political spectrum, you think it needs to be changed in vastly different ways. Some people think Obamacare needs to be gotten rid of and replaced. Some people think there needs to be more Obamacare. Some people think there has to be Medicare for all. And everybody, and sort of like the British House of Commons, it doesn't seem like we can get a quorum on any particular solution. But that was not the new thing. I knew that already. Every survey shows that people are all over the place on what they think should happen about health care. The new statistic that I saw was that he said a recent poll showed that 70% of Americans, even those who think health care is a mess, think that their particular plan is actually okay. They can see the doctor that they want to see. What they need covered is actually covered. And even if it's expensive and requires too much paperwork, it still is going to be there for them if they need it. And so while they are really concerned about people who don't have health care, which is a good thing, and they are concerned that they may lose their own health care, that it might not be there, what they've got right now is okay, and they desperately do not want to lose it. They don't want to lose it. And this, the author says, is the reason why health care reform is so hard in the United States. People who have something that actually is working for them and that is valuable to them don't want to lose it. And the fear of loss can be a really powerful motivator not to want to change. So it reminded me of a quote by Ron Heifetz. He's a well-known author who writes a lot about adaptive change within the church. And he says many times people think that people are afraid of change, and people that are trying to lead change are going, well, people fear change. But he says that's not really true. People don't fear change. People fear loss. People fear loss. And I think he's right about that, because actually, if a change is going to happen in my life, and it's going to make my life tremendously better, and everything's going to be, I am all for that change. But if a change is going to happen, and I don't know the outcome of that change, and I might lose what I have, I am not so sure I want to go down that road. Fear of loss. It can be a really significant motivator and a really significant debilitator. The fear of loss is so powerful because it's such a universal human experience. All of us have faced loss and suffered loss in our lives. The loss of someone we love to death, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, the loss of money or position, maybe the loss of health care. And we know that many losses are not things that we can simply just blow off and say, oh, yep, okay, something's changed and I've lost it, and now I can go on the way things were. We can't. Many of our losses mean that we have to face really deep and adaptive changes in our lives. Many leave lasting scars. So most of us, we don't like dwelling on the losses we've experienced in the past or contemplating the losses that we might face in the future. And we try to do everything we possibly can right now in order to minimize the possibility of losing anything else. So, why am I telling you all this happy stuff about fear of loss on Good Shepherd Sunday when we're supposed to be talking about fluffy sheep and, nice shepherds and stuff like that? So, the reason is that Jesus talks about sheep and shepherds for the entirety of the 10th chapter of John's Gospel. But it is not until towards the end of the chapter, the 22nd verse that we get to is the beginning of today's Gospel reading, in which John tells us the context in which he's been talking about all this sheep and shepherd stuff. John says that Jesus is celebrating Hanukkah, and he's celebrating Hanukkah in the temple in Jerusalem. So if you remember the Hanukkah story, Hanukkah is about the celebration of how Judas Maccabeus and his followers retook the temple from pagans who had seized and snatched the temple away from the Jews and desecrated the temple with pagan symbols. It had been snatched away from them. It had been lost, but Judas Maccabeus and his followers got it back. It was now found. And it would have been impossible in those days to stand in the rededicated temple and not to be realizing, with Romans occupying the country, pagans who had their own pagan symbols, it would have been impossible not to be afraid, not to first of all remember the loss of the temple to the pagans, and not to be afraid that this could happen again. That somebody else could come along and we would lose the temple again. And we know that that was an issue because John's Gospel says that one of the motivating factors for the temple authorities to want to get rid of Jesus was they were afraid that if Jesus kept going the way he was going, his followers would create a movement, it would upset the Romans, and the Romans would come and take our holy place away. That was one of the things that in John's Gospel motivates the whole Passion narrative, the fear of losing the temple yet again. And it's also important to remember that by the time these words were written down, the unthinkable had already happened. About 35 years after Jesus stood in the temple during Hanukkah, the Romans did actually come and take the temple away. Not only did they snatch the temple, they tore it down, block by block. They pushed it off the Temple Mount. It was gone. And for the first readers of John's Gospel, as they're reading these words and this story, it would have been impossible not to feel that deep sense of loss. The loss of the temple was a loss of an entire way of life. It was a loss of a symbol of God's presence. More even than a symbol of God's presence. As we celebrate First Communion this morning, we talk about how the bread and the wine are the actual bearers of Jesus' presence for us. For Jews and for early Jewish Christians too, the temple was not just a symbol of God's presence, it was the bearer of God's presence in the world for them. And if the temple was gone, had they lost God, had they been lost from God, what else might they lose? And so it's in this context of this fear of loss that Jesus makes this promise that nobody can snatch us away from God. What my Father has given me is greater than all else, and nobody can snatch it out of the Father's hand. That is, what Jesus is really doing with all this shepherd and sheep stuff is he's confronting loss and the fear of loss by promising us that we can never be lost from God. Not even death can snatch us out of God's hands. And that would have been a ridiculous and wild claim, except for Jesus' resurrection, showing us that it's actually true. And while Jesus' promise and Jesus' resurrection does not insulate us from the pain of loss, what he was saying to his followers both then and now is that loss is not the most significant reality in our lives. Even though it surely seemed that way to those ancient folks when they lost the temple, and even though it feels that way to us when we experience an incredibly deep loss in our lives. The part of dealing with the fear of loss is remembering that God's gift of new life actually is more powerful than the events which snatch things away from us. And that therefore Jesus is saying all of these things about sheep and shepherds, not to give us material for cute pictures of fluffy sheep and shepherds to hang on our walls, but actually to give us courage and strength to live forward into the future in spite of the losses we fear and the losses we face. That day in the temple, Jesus stood with people in the midst of the remembrance of a great loss and the fear, and a not unrealistic fear, of a future loss. He didn't tell them that they had nothing to worry about, or that loss would never happen to them again. But what he did do for those ancient people and for us was to promise us his active and living presence in the midst of our losses and our fears. He showed them and he shows us that God's power to give and restore life actually is greater than the sum of our fears and our losses. And he promised them, and he promises us, that no matter what happens, absolutely none of us will ever be lost from God.